Welcome back to Dead Reckoning, the Human Life Expectancy channel. Having detailed 7 ethical perspectives and used them to conclude that it is ethical to try to live longer in our last 2 videos, in this video we'll explore ethical issues related to new technologies that offer the prospect of revolutionizing human reproduction. As a quick reminder, 2 technologies are poised to revolutionize human reproduction. IVF is in vitro fertilization, which involves sperm fertilizing eggs in vitro or in glass or petri dishes, resulting in blastocysts, which are then implanted for gestation and birth. PGD is Preimplantation Genetic Diagnosis, which involves conducting genetic and epigenetic tests on blastocysts resulting from IVF, which then allows parents to make more informed decisions about which ones they wish to implant. See our video on revolutionizing human reproduction to acquaint yourself with these extraordinary new technologies. These technologies, though, raise 2 core ethical issues that we'll explore in this video. First, is it ethical for parents to select their children using IVF and PGD? And second, if so, what range of characteristics is it ethical for a parent to select? So, is it ethical for parents to select their children using IVF and PGD? Countries around the world seem to have decided that it is. There are now over 8 million people alive today because their parents used IVF PGD to select them as blastocysts to be implanted in their mother's uteruses to become healthy babies, indistinguishable from babies that were naturally conceived. Adoption of these technologies will only increase with time as they become less expensive and the range of characteristics that parents can select increases. Still, large numbers of people doing something is no guarantee that it's ethical. However, the 7 perspectives we covered in our Ethical Perspectives video suggest that it is. The evolution exists and doesn't stop perspective makes clear that allowing parents to have increasing choice in their children is a part of natural evolution that should not and practically cannot be stopped. Exercising greater choice and control over reproduction has always resulted in accusations that doing so is unnatural or that doing so is playing God. However, such accusations ignore that animals have effectively been choosing the genes of their offspring through sexual selection for over 600 million years. Humans and many other animals have always sought to select for the most healthy, viable children through the process of sexual selection. Every insect, bird, or mammal that selects a mate is engaging in a form of genetic screening in an effort to give their offspring an unfair genetic advantage over others. This is natural evolution, and to disrupt it is neither ethical nor, again, likely possible. IVF and PGD simply allow us to do this more directly and precisely. Author and futurist Ramez Nam reminds us, quote, "Playing God is actually the highest expression of human nature. The urges to improve ourselves, to master our environment, and to set our children on the best path possible have been the fundamental driving forces of all of human history." At both evolutionary and societal levels, it's difficult to imagine that women and men would ever relinquish their right to reproduce with partners of their own choosing, or cease to exercise ever more control over who their children become. Doing so would not only kill the primary engine of our own evolution, which is sexual selection, but would also reverse centuries of societal progress toward individual freedom. IVF PGD builds on a century-long trend of giving people more control over their reproduction. Across the globe, forced marriage is now rare and widely condemned by international opinion. Today, over 43% of adults use modern and safe contraception. Ultrasounds are now a routine part of neonatal care in most countries, and abortion is now available in 98% of countries in at least some situations. Non-invasive prenatal genetic testing, or NIPT, was introduced to the United States and Western Europe in late 2011 to help parents determine the risk that the fetus will be born with certain genetic abnormalities. NIPT is rapidly becoming available in the Middle East, South America, South and Southeast Asia, and Africa. Now, genetic and epigenetic testing, together with in vitro fertilization, IVF, are allowing parents even greater control over their reproduction. Also, the alternative to parents actively choosing characteristics of their offspring is to make them subject to a genetic lottery where there are inevitably winners and losers. And since gambling is usually considered to be a vice, it's hard to argue that natural reproduction with its random outcomes is an intrinsically more ethical approach. Also, the human rights and equality perspective suggests that parents have the right to have children if they are able. IVF allows couples that cannot conceive naturally to have children, greatly improving their lives. This perspective also suggests that parents have the right to give their children the best possibility of a good life, and that children have the right to come into the world unimpaired and without preventable physical or mental handicaps. The fact that IVF PGD increases the number of people who can have children and increases parents' ability to ensure they have healthy, viable children gives them solid ethical support. What could be more ethical than creating more and healthier babies? Oxford bioethicist Julian Salvescu wrote that parents have a, quote, moral obligation to create children with the best chance of the best life. In our Revolutionizing Human Reproduction video, we showed how IVF with PGD could dramatically reduce genetic and many other diseases, as well as offer the prospect for parents to have more power in choosing the attributes they believe will give their child the best chance. Also, on what basis could we deny parents the choice to improve their children's genes when we accept the rights of parents to benefit their children in every other way? Today, parents are expected to give their children the best education, medical, and dental care they're able. How could these be considered ethical if selecting for the health of their children is not? However, whatever constitutes beneficial characteristics must be defined and enforced, and both of these are difficult. More on this below. The proportionality perspective further suggests that parents' rights to have children and choose beneficial characteristics for their children, for example, not to suffer from common genetic diseases, and the rights of the chosen children to live their best lives should outweigh any perceived rights that a blastocyst might be entitled to. Let's consider the proportionality of blastocysts. As a reminder from our Revolutionizing Human Reproduction video, IVF involves fertilizing eggs in a laboratory, allowing them to grow for about 5 days into blastocysts, which have about 200 to 300 cells and a diameter of 0.1 to 0.2 millimeters. For comparison, the average housefly has over 500,000 cells, and the average adult human has 37.2 trillion cells. Blastocysts possess an inner cell mass, which subsequently forms the embryo. The outer layer of the blastocyst consists of cells collectively called the trophoblast that ultimately become the placenta. Also, most human blastocysts not involving IVF fail to implant and survive. Existing data show that at least 73% of natural single conceptions fail to survive the first 6 weeks of gestation. Of the remainder, about 90% will survive to term. And of course, this does not include the virtually 100% of embryos that fail to implant in women who use an intrauterine device, an IUD, as a form of birth control. Also, blastocysts have no ability to feel, while human parents and babies can avoid lifelong pain and disability from genetic conditions. Biologically, no nerve cells are formed in the first week after fertilization. They don't even begin to form until about 2.5 weeks after conception. Also, now that Dolly the sheep was cloned from a skin cell, and Yamanaka and his team have successfully created induced pluripotent stem cells, or iPSCs, from skin cells that can be turned into gametes to create embryos. Again, see the Revolutionizing Human Reproduction video. Each of those cells also has the potential to become a life. This makes it hard to argue that blastocysts should be treated differently because of their potential to become a human. No sane human thinks twice about killing their skin cells by scratching an itch, despite the fact that those cells could now become humans. Author and biologist Lee M. Silver notes, quote, "If a human life can begin in the absence of conception, which it now can, then it's scientifically invalid to say that conception must mark the beginning of each human life." In addition, the technology doesn't stop perspective suggests that it would be difficult or impossible to stop parents from using IVF PGD even if we wanted them to. These technologies are increasingly available, and the costs of using them are falling rapidly. Given how badly people want to have children and their strong will to give them every advantage, any prohibitions of their use would certainly lead to black markets, medical tourism, and other means to circumvent them. Indeed, it may be immoral not to use IVF and PGD to prevent children from suffering from an increasing array of diseases that can be avoided. So let's move on to the next question. What range of characteristics is it ethical for a parent to select for their children? In theory, using IVF PGD, parents could select for any natural genetic or epigenetically determined characteristic, or phenotype as biologists call them. We say natural because IVF PGD does not involve artificial manipulations of the genome or epigenome using genetic engineering. We'll discuss the ethics of that in our next video. As we saw in our genetic and epigenetic testing video, parents can select to avoid tens of thousands of genetic diseases and for sex and multiple physical traits such as eye, hair, skin color, nose shape, cheek dimples, male pattern baldness, strong bones, and even lean muscles. And many more could soon be added, including behavioral traits, athletic ability, and even intelligence. So is it ethical for parents to select these characteristics at will to create so-called designer babies? First, since selecting for sex, height, athletic ability, intelligence, or other characteristics could potentially have enormous positive impacts on the lives of the individuals, this right should not be denied lightly. As we've said, parents have always chosen attributes of their children through the selection of their mates. In almost all societies, parents also have broad rights to guide and mold their children as they wish. They have the rights to name their children whatever they want, even Moon Unit Zappa, and influence their beliefs, for example, by providing education and adhering to one of many religions or atheism. Direct and pay for their education, reward behaviors they find good and punish behaviors they find bad, and even change their minds and bodies through drugs such as cognition-enhancing medication, antidepressants, mood stabilizer, and anti-anxiety drugs, and elective cosmetic surgery, all without significant ethical challenge. Accordingly, for reasons similar to the ones used to support parents' rights to use IVF PGD in the first place, it seems the parent should have broad latitude in deciding what characteristics to select. But are there limits? The primary ethical issues occur when a parent's right to select interferes either with the rights of the child a blastocyst might become, or in situations where the selection would have strong negative impacts on society. Children, of course, have the right to be born with healthy brains and bodies. But this argues for the increased use of IVF PGD so that unhealthy characteristics can be avoided. However, reasonable people can disagree on what characteristics are reasonable to choose. To forward challenging examples, what if you and your spouse were deaf or had dwarfism and you wanted your children to have the same condition? Should that be allowed? This is not an academic issue. Some couples perhaps understandably want to have children like themselves. As another challenging example, what if some parents wanted to have a child with Down syndrome? Should that be allowed? Wouldn't that unduly breach the right of the child? And if not, do we really want a society where there's no members with this condition? This leads to the second important issue, when the parent's rights to select might have negative implications for society. So for example, what if allowing people to select the gender of their children results in an unbalanced gender ratio across society? This also is not an academic issue. In the 1950s, the invention of the ultrasound gave parents the ability to assess the health of their fetus, greatly improving prenatal care. By the 1980s, the 20-week fetal ultrasound was common practice in the US and many other countries. However, since fetal ultrasounds often reveal the gender of the fetus, they led to an unintended and ethically dubious consequence. In some countries, it's sometimes used by parents to select or even abort fetuses based on their sex. This resulted in the abortion of millions of female fetuses, creating dramatic gender imbalances in some countries. China has the greatest gender imbalance of any large country, at 119 boys born for every 100 girls. The country has 30 to 40 million missing women, a situation caused by a preference for boys and ongoing restrictions on women's reproductive rights, exacerbated by the one-child policy, which was in place from 1979 to 2015. India also has a serious gender imbalance problem, with about 110 boys for every 100 girls and over 40 million missing women. In 2020, the sex ratio of the total population in India was 108.18 males per 100 females. Azerbaijan, Vietnam, and Armenia also have significant gender imbalances resulting from a preference for male children. Even a seemingly innocuous birth order preference for one sex over the other can have big consequences. For example, even among parents who would like to have both male and female children, a preference for having the male child first, perhaps to provide protection for his younger sister, could cause all the couples who made that decision and subsequently did not have additional children for whatever reason to skew the overall population statistics. Countries with large gender imbalances will likely face a marriage squeeze and societal upheaval as millions of excess men tried and failed to find wives as they come of age. Another issue is, what if parents' choices result in increased or reduced species diversity? While limiting genetic diseases and other negative genetic outcomes is very likely good for society, in general, genetic diversity accelerates evolution and makes our species more adaptable to future conditions. What if everyone decided they wanted their offspring to look like Barbie or Ken? On the other hand, what if parents increasingly wanted their children to excel in truly unique ways, driving greater species diversity? Would that make it harder to maintain equality for all or cause increased social friction? So, at what point do such societal issues start to limit parents' rights to choose what they wish for their children? These and related questions are now worth consideration, and we urge you to judge for yourself and to contribute to these important conversations. To protect their societies, some governments have tried to weigh in on these issues on behalf of their current and future citizens. However, exerting strong societal control over parents' choice is commonly regarded as unethical and is always difficult. Outside of war, genocide, and authoritarian limits on human reproduction, which have never worked out well, there are no policies or even frameworks for how such societal rights might be balanced against the interests of parents and children. The discredited eugenics movements of the past are now widely regarded as unethical. Recall from our Is Evolution Evolving video that eugenics is a breeding science to select and preserve desirable human traits, and it was started by Francis Galton, who is Darwin's cousin. In the 1900s, it tragically grew into programs that far too many governments used to support sterilization and even murder of people with traits considered undesirable. These were clearly ethical violations of the human rights and equality perspective. Importantly, parents' use of IVF and PGD to select blastocysts differs from historical eugenics programs in important respects that address these violations. As we've noted, under the proportionality perspective, there's a world of difference between forced sterilization of adult humans and even murder that have been part of historical eugenics on one hand, and the failure to select unimplanted blastocysts on the other. Under the human rights perspective, there's a huge difference between parents' rights to use IVF and PGD to choose on behalf of their own unborn children and governments or other agencies choosing on behalf of living adults. Today, liberal societies protect individuals from the excessive power of the state. In many states, this translates into, quote, a woman's right to choose, which is increasingly including the choice of some of a child's characteristics. Softer forms of influencing parents include policies such as taxes or subsidies to discourage and encourage certain parental decisions. For example, as we saw in our How Will Population Growth End video, some countries are now trying to increase their fertility rates by offering incentives to would-be parents. Those efforts have proven both expensive and relatively ineffective. Not surprisingly, money seems to be a less important motivator in having children than other factors. Because the societal impacts of parents' increased abilities to select the attributes of their children will be so difficult to control, their impacts could be dramatic. We'll explore this further in our Societal Impacts of Living Longer video. So for now, the practical answer to the question, what characteristics can a parent select for, seem to be some, but not all. At one end of the spectrum, today there's strong support that it is ethical for parents to choose and select blastocysts that are free from genetic diseases. In vitro fertilization has allowed the screening for genetic diseases since the 1970s. While there was a huge uproar when this first became possible, and skeptics made statements such as, test tube babies have no soul, now over 8 million babies have been born this way, and it's widely regarded as both normal and ethical. In 2013, only 12% of Americans said that IVF was morally wrong, versus 40% opposing abortion at that same time. As author Siddhartha Mukherjee writes, quote, justifiable interventions, the decision to abort a child with Down syndrome, say, or intervene surgically on a woman with a BRCA1 mutation, have been defined through social and medical consensus, and all interventions have been governed by complete freedom of choice. Most also approve of a parent's right to have children that might serve as tissue or organ donors for sick siblings or family members. However, once we switch from curing diseases and avoiding death to enhancing ourselves in one way or another, many question our right to choose. In 2002, a Johns Hopkins University poll showed that 74% of Americans surveyed approved PGD to avoid serious disease, but only 28% were comfortable with selecting gender, and 20% approved of using it to select other desirable non-disease-related traits like intelligence, which, by the way, is not currently selectable. We suspect that parents facing the real option to improve their children will feel differently about this than those who do not currently have this option, and who may fear being superseded by future, more capable generations. We agree with Harvard gene editing pioneer George Wood, who said, quote, "Why shouldn't we leave this decision about gene editing to individuals and parents, just as we do with other reproductive choices? I don't see why eliminating a disability, giving a child blue eyes, or adding 15 IQ points is truly a threat to public mortality." Unquote. Reflecting these ethics, governments have created regulations on the specific characteristics that parents can select. Almost all governments allow parents to be able to choose to give their children healthy lives without avoidable genetic and other diseases. Some allow parents to choose criteria that would allow a child to serve as a tissue or organ donor for a sick sibling or family member. Others allow parents to select for sex, eye color, or a range of other characteristics that can now be identified. Some even allow parents to select for genetic conditions such as dwarfism or deafness. So to summarize, in vitro fertilization, IVF, and preimplantation genetic diagnosis, PGD, will give parents unprecedented abilities to choose the attributes of their children. But they run into ethical issues when these choices interfere with a child's right to a happy, healthy life or have negative impacts on society. These technologies will have such a profound impact on humanity and life on Earth that deciding how to use them and how we'll choose to evolve is among the top existential issues facing humanity, along with human population growth, climate change, pandemics, nuclear weapons, natural cataclysms, and the global food supply transformation. More on these in upcoming videos. Perhaps the biggest risk to human life from these technologies is that their initial inappropriate or unethical use might cause a public backlash and slow their implementation, resulting in thousands or even millions of unnecessary deaths. There's no way around it. These issues need to be addressed quickly, but sensitively and collaboratively across the globe. Accordingly, it's imperative that we engage in global conversation to clarify the ethical issues involved with their application. As the ethical issues associated with these technologies are resolved, they should be codified in regulations that better ensure appropriate use. In our next video, we'll examine whether it's ethical to use another technology that's poised to revolutionize our species and others, genetic engineering. In the meantime, please hit the like button below, subscribe to the Human Life Expectancy channel to make sure you don't miss our next videos, and post comments for the topics you'd like to have us cover. Thanks for joining us. Till next time, as we say at Human Life Expectancy Inc., Hi-hua! Do what you can to help yourself and help us all to live longer.